If you've been trying to use AI to get genuinely useful outputs, but just haven't been able to quite get there yet, then this video is for you. I'm going to show you how to start thinking about completing tasks with AI in a way that actually plays to its strengths and will give you useful, repeatable outputs. And to kick it straight off, the first thing to do is to start thinking workflow first. And what that really means is, instead of thinking, I want to create a risk register, and then typing into ChatGPT, Claude, whichever one you use, create a risk register, upload a few documents about the project, and then go ahead and do it. That's too many steps for it to go and do to actually create something useful. And you'll end up doing a bunch of back and forth with it. And it'll just take longer than if you just gone and done it yourself. So the important thing is to think about that into workflows. And so then you're looking at AI helping with certain steps in that workflow and not the whole thing. And more importantly, you're giving it the steps that you would essentially go through to complete that. So what it ends up with is a structured task list to work through with key points where you check in and make sure it's on the right track. And you also give it examples of exactly what you want that output to look like and the context it needs to be able to make sure it's specific to your use case. That's fundamentally what thinking the workflow first approach is, and not trying to put in one big task and just hoping it will get there. Because the reality is, when it keeps making decisions like that by itself, it just won't. So what does that look like as well in terms of choosing a workflow to start with? Because when we look at a construction business, there are hundreds of workflows that we essentially go through. So that's things like, if you're looking at creating a risk register as a workflow as a whole, inside of that workflow, there's 5 or 6 key tasks that you're going to be doing to be able to create that workflow. And then if we zoom out a little bit and we look at something like an estimate, then there's 10 or so steps or workflows you could break that down into, in terms of actually reviewing the documents, pulling out a requirement register, actually going ahead and doing the takeoff. So saying to an AI to go ahead and create an estimate or create a risk register just is too much for it to try and figure out and handle on its own. But you can create things like skills that you give it essentially the key steps for it to work through and the human checkpoints to go through, so that it will come out with an actual useful answer. And the best way to do that is often to create a breakdown of all of the workflows that you do sort of day to day with whatever role you're in terms of your construction business or just in your project management role. And then what you can do is actually take a proper look at each one of those workflows and sort of measure it against a few key things. And the first is, how much of an AI fit is it really? And the best measure or metric of that is how much of that workflow is really just taking information from one format to another. So if we're looking at things like creating a risk register, essentially a big chunk of that is looking at what the specific project is and the documents around that, including any professional reports like geotech reports, and then what we've learned in the past in terms of lessons learned from similar projects before. And we're putting that into a new format where we can track and measure that risk. So there is a large portion of that is just transferring data from one format to another. In the human sense, what that is those lessons learned, is experience you've built over time running projects. You can scan a project, and you can see basically where those are. So there is an element of that AI can help there. Won't fully replace it, but it can help. So an okay candidate. And then the second part of that is, yeah, okay, good. That is a good use case for AI. But is it something that's actually going to save me real time? It's something I do often, and it can take like hours when you do it manually. So that's an important factor too, is making sure that it's going to take some time investment to set up this workflow so that AI can help you with it. Am I going to see a return on that fairly quickly? Or the other way to think about it is, should I be starting with this workflow? Or is there another one that's going to save me more time and better fits that data transformation model? And the third is also a really important one of it being verifiable. So if you go ahead and the AI creates a risk register and it gets something wrong, are you able to pick that up before it becomes a real issue? And that isn't as easy as it sounds, because it will produce something that looks right, and picking out what's wrong in that without reviewing it in a good level of detail can be hard. In the sense of a risk register, you could go through that and force yourself to read it point by point, and that may be what it takes. And then you can know, yes, I agree, no, I don't. So that's important too. Whereas if you're looking at things like it's created a takeoff, much harder to actually go ahead and verify whether it's done it correctly, because the level of involvement in terms of having a gut feel whether it's right or wrong, like you can kind of with a risk register, is completely not there with a takeoff if you haven't actually done it yourself and can just cross-check it point by point. So that's important too. And then the third is that it is detailed steps for AI to be able to follow. And this, you can break every work down into enough detailed steps for AI to follow, but it's important you have human checkpoints where it makes sense. So that's the difference between going create a risk register and giving it 10 processes that you follow yourself when you go ahead and create the risk register. So I'll get into the example later, but that is important in terms of being able to give AI the best means for success, basically. And so when we're breaking down these workflows and we're creating that list, what are we really looking for, and what is going to be useful to help us make those decisions? And really it comes down to sort of 5 key points in that. And one is the input. So we need to know what we ourselves use when we do that task, so that we can also make sure the AI has that. So for example, if we're looking at the risk register again, then it needs to know as much as it can about the project and the contract and everything else in and around that. So that'll be its inputs for its task. And then along with the direct inputs, there needs to be some sort of context for it to be able to better understand that. And so for the example of risk register, that is things like the company policy around what contracts they will sign, what clauses they're willing to accept, things like the lessons learned database from past projects, and then also the template of what the company risk register looks like, so that it knows what it's shooting for. And the third is the output. So this is what you actually want out of this workflow. In the case of the risk register, it is a completed risk register, obviously. But what's more important with the outputs is that when you're creating this workflow that will become repeatable, in that process, it's ensuring that you have 3 to 5 really good examples of what you want that output to look like. So these will be ones you've created manually before. And that way, when the AI is creating those steps in the workflow, not only does it know what those steps are, but it also knows what it's actually shooting for, which massively increases how reliable it will be in future when you're completing it on new tasks. And then the last 2 here are really important and can be forgotten, but it's exactly where what the human role is when it comes to actually creating this output. So AI can't do everything. There is going to be points where a human needs to be inside of that process to make sure it's doing it correctly, or to add on top of what AI has started. And then the last one is obviously AI's role. And I touched on that before about where it excels in terms of data transformation and that side of things, rather than getting it to create things, make things up by itself, because it just won't do a good job of that and it won't be exactly what you're after. So that's a good way to break down each of your workflows into sort of that more like what it is, what it needs, what's the output is, and then where a human role fits in and where an AI role fits in. And then moving on, let's look at like an actual example of what that looks like in terms of if you're going through your own workflows. So again, I've touched on it quite a bit already, but for the project risk register. So let's look at what the inputs are. And for a purely example case, the inputs are have your project documents. So everything like the spec, the drawings, all of that. You have things like your geotech reports, so any professional reports are part of that. The contract, lessons learned, and even some market context, like especially at the moment, there's a lot going on that adds a lot of risk to construction projects. And then also you can add a risk register template in there as well. Then some further context, essentially. These can cross over a little bit. The way I'd be looking at the inputs is like what is directly relevant to this specific risk register that you want to create. So like lessons learned that are directly applicable to this input. And then the context is more broadly what you would add to everyone. So that'd be things like, in general, just the company policy, and then lessons learned from past project history. So longer ones that you may have forgotten about or don't know about, and they can go and have a look through those as well to see if there's any relevant things there. And then the output is very simple. What you want is a working live risk register. That's it. So you can carry on, you can keep adding to it and go from there. Now let's look at what the human role would be in something like this. So what I have here is that the human actually does need to read the documents. It does need to understand them. And then it needs to review what the AI has actually surfaced. So it's important that, yes, the AI can start the project off and get things going, but review that. And then there's going to be an element of the need to add their own additional ones based on their experience from all the projects they've delivered before them. And like I said, AI's role is basically is going to read it all the documents and everything. It's going to surface the past project risks. You'll be able to better connect some of the specific examples from other past projects than a human would from memory. And it can layer in the market context as well. So it's really ready for us just to use straight away. And then the human role would pick up in there to review and then add. And essentially, there is ways you could have AI monitor that throughout the project, but really there's going to need to be a human in there as well. And you can see, then you get the product of, well, the output, which is the risk register. So it needs that level of in-depth thinking when you're going through and creating these workflows that you eventually will use for AI to be able to have it produce an output that is actually what you want. And then moving on to more of a foundation of how you can go about this. So you can sit there and say, yes, that all sounds well and good. I understand I need to map everything out really clearly, but I'm busy. So how do I actually go ahead and do that? And really we've gone through it already, but the fundamental things are, first, map the workflows, map what's the input, the output, the method, the steps you go through to actually complete them. And then you can look at where the human fits and where the AI fits. And then you pick up exactly which one is essentially the thing you hate the most, the thing that's taking the most time, costing the most money, whatever it may be, correlating that with what AI is actually good at doing. So where can it take off the most burden from you, essentially? And then we go into the steps of, okay, I understand that now, but how do I go ahead and do that? And there's 3 ways that I've put in here of essentially doing that. Way 1 is the solo way. So this is where you actually go through, you spend the time creating that workflow sheet, and then you pick out your workflows. You start with just one workflow, you build it out really well. It will take some time to do because you want to make sure you spend that time up front and getting it right, so that every time you repeat that workflow in the future, you know it's going to give you an output that's genuinely useful and not give you a 50-page document that's completely irrelevant or in a format that doesn't make sense for you, or it just simply gives you a generic answer from what it's trained on through the entire internet. So spending that time up front to do it. The second way is more of a leveraged way. So this is what we were going for with contractors, which is essentially we have built the core workflows inside of there that are in all construction projects essentially. And they're built on best practices to start with. And then what you do is it's much easier to then modify those existing workflows to have it so it matches your templates and the way that your business runs through a couple of quick prompts back and forth. And when you get stuck, we have Q&A calls, so you can jump on one of those and then get your specific question answered, fix it, and then you have a working workflow quickly. Because it's important when you do start these things that you want to get to meaningful, useful results as soon as possible to be able to save yourself time that can then free up you building the next workflow for you. So that's the leveraged approach. And the last one is a personalized one where really you don't care too much about playing around with these tools and things yourselves, but you see the value in it and maybe you're short on time. And that's where you can do things like a one-on-one build. And essentially what that will be is an ongoing meeting, a relationship, say once a week for an hour, where you get your questions answered. But in between times, someone like myself can go away and build out those workflows for you based on all the inputs and context that is needed for each of them, help you create that workflow sheet so you know which ones to tackle first. And then each week you're getting a meaningful move forward in terms of having AI be a part of your workflow and start to save you time. And you also get the benefit of learning while it gets built, because you have that hour session each week. And then you also each week get a new workflow you can then go and use for yourself and have been taught how to use yourself. So you essentially fast track going from using no AI to actually having 3, 4, 5 workflows that you really use regularly. So that's the other way to do it. Now, to wrap it all up, I just wanted to put this video out there in terms of making it really clear about how you need to be breaking down into workflows, how you can't just go ahead and ask it to do 50 different tasks in one go, and that there is 3 ways essentially about going and doing this. So if it really is something you want to move forward for, you know which one will fit you best and how you can best move forward. And if you're interested in joining contractors, the link's in the description, so you can go and check that out and download your first workflow and essentially have something working within 7 days. That's our core goal. If you want a more personalized approach, there's also a link where you can book a call and we can run through what might work for you. So I hope that helped, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.